The Imperial Japanese military maintained detailed administrative records throughout the war. Their documents described a system they called the Special Comfort Facility Administration. The official terminology was precise, bureaucratic, clinical. According to military reports filed with headquarters, these facilities housed women who had volunteered to support troop morale. The word volunteer appeared consistently across thousands of pages of archived materials. The paperwork was meticulous. Recruitment forms, transport manifests, station operational reports, medical inspection schedules, everything documented, everything filed in triplicate. The system operated with the full approval of military command. It had budgets allocated, supply chains established, administrative hierarchies defined. On paper, it looked like any other wartime logistics operation. In 1991, a woman named Kim Hak-sun appeared at a press conference in Seoul. She was 67 years old. She had carried silence for nearly 50 years. When she finally spoke, her words contradicted every official document the Japanese government had carefully preserved. "I was 14 when they came to my village. They said I would work in a factory. Instead, I was taken to a military station and locked in a room. For 3 years, I could not leave. There were no volunteers. We were girls who could not refuse." The official military archive said one thing. The women who survived said another. Between governmental documentation and lived testimony, the lie became visible. The system called it comfort. The women who endured it called it captivity. This is verified history, not speculation. What we know about the comfort station system comes from multiple independent sources that survived despite systematic efforts at destruction. The evidence exists because some documents could not be burned fast enough. Some women lived long enough to speak, and some researchers refused to stop looking. Military administrative records from the Japanese Defense Agency archives detail station establishment procedures, operational guidelines, and resource allocation. These files are real, dated, signed by commanding officers. Medical records from military hospitals show the systematic health inspections imposed on women in these facilities, including treatment logs for infections and pregnancy-related complications. Testimony from survivors, collected over decades by organizations including the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance, provides first-hand accounts that align precisely with verified locations, dates, and operational patterns. Historical research by Professor Yoshimi Yoshiaki at Chuo University uncovered classified materials in the 1990s that the government had insisted did not exist. The gaps in documentation are equally revealing. Census records from occupied Korea, China, and Southeast Asian territories show unexplained population declines among young women during the war years. Village registration documents list girls who simply disappeared, with no official explanation for where they went. The absence of records is itself evidence of deliberate erasure, of a system designed to leave minimal trace. Most women caught in this system left no written accounts. They could not record their experiences while living them. Many died before liberation. Those who survived often remained silent for decades, carrying shame that was never theirs to bear. The historical record is incomplete, not because events were rare, but because the apparatus operated through deliberate concealment. What remains tells us enough. Military files prove institutional organization. Medical records prove systematic physical harm. Survivor testimony proves individual suffering that spanned years. Archaeological evidence from former station sites proves the physical infrastructure of imprisonment. This is what the evidence reveals about her reality. Imperial Japan's military did not seize absolute authority through sudden revolution. Power accumulated gradually across the 1930s as the armed forces positioned themselves as the nation's ultimate protectors. By 1937, when full-scale war began in China, military command had effectively superseded civilian government. Generals shaped national policy. Military law took precedence over civil law. The doctrine of total war provided justification for any measure deemed necessary for victory. The comfort station structure began not as policy, but as improvised practice. In occupied territories, soldiers took women by force, creating immediate problems of military discipline and venereal disease transmission. Then, sometime around 1932, military planners recognized an opportunity. If this was occurring regardless, why not systematize it, control it, organize it, transform chaos into institutional infrastructure? That shift from spontaneous violence to bureaucratic administration appears in planning documents discussing comfort facilities as necessary wartime support systems. The official justification was disease prevention and troop morale management. Military reports framed comfort stations as pragmatic solutions to protect soldiers from infection and prevent assault incidents against local populations that might trigger resistance movements in occupied areas. The language was rational, administrative, clinical. Women were classified as necessary resources in supply chain documentation, listed alongside ammunition, food rations, and medical supplies. But the system served another function that official documents never explicitly stated. It was a mechanism of absolute control, not just of the women, but of the soldiers who used them. The military created a hierarchy where access became a privilege tied to rank and obedience. For officers, access was nearly unlimited. For enlisted men, access was regulated, scheduled, monitored. The machinery reinforced military hierarchy through sexual access to captive women. For the women themselves, the apparatus transformed them from individuals into military property. They were assigned registration numbers. Their movements were tracked in daily logs. Their bodies were treated as imperial assets requiring maintenance. The dehumanization was not incidental. It was structural, embedded in every administrative procedure. The operation required extensive participation to function. Military bureaucrats processed recruitment paperwork and station operational reports. Transport officers arranged logistics for moving women between facilities. Local collaborators in occupied territories identified and recruited girls. Medical officers conducted mandatory inspections and provided minimal treatment. Guards enforced confinement and monitored room occupancy. Civilian contractors constructed and maintained facilities. Each participant found justification, following orders, earning payment, serving the empire's sacred mission, or simply surviving in a militarized society where refusal meant punishment. Recruitment methods varied by location, but followed consistent patterns of deception. In Korea, which Japan had colonized in 1910, recruiters promised factory work, restaurant employment, or nursing positions. Families struggling economically were offered cash advances. Some girls were told they would do laundry for soldiers, technically true, but deliberately incomplete information. In occupied China and Southeast Asia, methods were often more direct. Girls were simply taken from villages by military police or collaborating local authorities. The Korean colonial government, under Japanese control, actively assisted procurement. Local officials received quotas to meet. The physical infrastructure of stations was deliberately designed for captivity. Buildings were isolated from civilian areas but located near military installations. High walls or fences surrounded the perimeter. Guards controlled all entrance and exit points. Women lived in small rooms, typically measuring 6 to 8 tatami mats. Some rooms were shared among multiple women. Furnishings were minimal: a mattress, perhaps a small table, basic washing facilities. Medical inspection rooms, Administrative offices for station managers and waiting areas for soldiers were standard architectural features. The design made escape not just difficult, but practically impossible. The psychological architecture was equally calculated. Women were stripped of their names and assigned numbers, or Japanese names they often could not pronounce. Frequent transfers between stations prevented emotional attachment to locations or formation of support networks with local populations. They were told their families had been informed they were working far away, that return was impossible, that outside these walls they would be viewed as contaminated and worthless. The prison was constructed as much through psychological conditioning as through physical barriers. Her name was Park Yong-sim. This detail matters because the system tried to erase it. She was 17 years old in the spring of 1942 when a recruiter arrived in her village in southern Korea. The man wore a suit and carried official-looking papers. He explained that the Patriotic Labor Corps needed young women to work in Japanese factories supporting the war effort. The pay would be good. Food and housing would be provided. Park Yong-sim's family was struggling. Her father had been forced to sell their small rice paddy. Her younger siblings were often hungry. She believed she could help them. That belief became the trap. The journey took 4 days by train and ship. Park Yong-sim traveled with 11 other girls from surrounding villages, all promised the same opportunity. 2 men supervised their travel, men who called themselves employment agents. The girls talked nervously about what factory work might involve, whether they would learn new skills, how soon they could send money home. Park Yong-sim thought about buying winter clothes for her younger brother. They arrived at a converted warehouse compound in Manchuria. The employment agents became guards, the doors locked behind them. A Japanese military officer explained through a Korean interpreter that they would be serving the Imperial Army in a different capacity than they had been told. One girl began crying loudly and demanding to return home. A guard struck her across the face with enough force to knock her down. The message required no translation. Park Yong-sim was given a Japanese name she could barely pronounce. She was assigned to room number 7. The rules were explained once. Obey all commands, maintain cleanliness according to inspection standards, submit to medical examinations twice weekly, never attempt to leave the premises. Punishment for rule violations was not specified in detail. The vagueness was intentional. Imagination filled the gaps. On her 3rd day, she was summoned for the first time. She had hoped, with desperate naivety, that perhaps the initial violence had been theater, meant to establish control, but that actual duties might be tolerable. When she understood what was truly required, she refused. She was not beaten. Instead, she was locked in a storage room without food, water, or light for 2 days. When guards brought her out, weakened and disoriented, she was given a choice: comply with station operations or return to the storage room indefinitely. The station operated on a quota system, details of which survived in military operational reports. Each woman was expected to serve a minimum number of soldiers daily. The number fluctuated based on troop presence, but averaged between 10 and 20. On weekends, or when military units prepared for deployment, the numbers increased to 30 or more. There were no rest days. Illness was not considered sufficient reason for exemption, unless fever exceeded a specified threshold. Park Yong-sim learned dissociation. Her body remained in room 7 while her mind fled elsewhere. She thought about the river near her village where she had played as a child. She recited poems her mother had taught her. She counted ceiling boards, calculated patterns, focused on any mental task that took her away from immediate sensation. This was not resilience. It was the minimum psychological adaptation required for survival. The other women found their own methods of endurance. Kim Sun-ok, who had been promised nursing work, sang hymns silently to herself. Lee Myung-ja, told she would work in a military canteen, mentally practiced Japanese vocabulary she had been learning before her capture. Another woman, whose name Park Yong-sim never learned because she was transferred after 2 weeks, rocked continuously when alone in her room. Each woman carried her own invisible refuge. They could not form genuine relationships with each other. The station's design deliberately prevented solidarity. Women were assigned to different rooms, kept on different schedules, rotated through common areas at staggered times. Speaking to each other was technically permitted, but practically difficult. The isolation was intentional. United women might resist. Separated women could only endure. The mandatory medical inspection system was documented extensively in surviving military health records. Women were examined for venereal disease twice weekly. The examinations were invasive, conducted without privacy, performed by military doctors who treated the women as equipment requiring maintenance rather than as patients deserving care. The doctors documented findings in clinical language, recording infections, injuries, and pregnancies with detached precision. Infections spread rapidly despite these inspections. Military medical records from multiple stations show treatment for gonorrhea, syphilis, and bacterial infections at rates exceeding 50% of women in some facilities. Soldiers were not required to use protection. When women became infected, they received basic treatment, usually painful injections, and were expected to return to service within days. Park Yong-sim contracted her first infection in month 4. The military doctor administered injections that caused severe cramping and fever. She was given 2 days of rest, then returned to her assigned schedule. The infection recurred 3 weeks later. This pattern, infection, minimal treatment, immediate return to service, continued throughout her captivity. Pregnancy was another documented consequence. Military records indicate various prevention methods were employed, but failures occurred frequently. Standard procedure was termination, performed by military medical staff, often without anesthesia or with inadequate anesthesia. Complications included severe infections, hemorrhaging, and permanent reproductive damage. Some women died. Their deaths were recorded in station logs as illness or simply noted as reductions in personnel counts. Park Yong-sim became pregnant twice during her 18 months at the station. Both pregnancies were terminated in the station's medical room. The second procedure resulted in infections severe enough to cause high fever and bleeding that would not stop. She was transferred to the military hospital for 3 weeks. During her absence, another woman was brought to room 7 to maintain station operational capacity. When Park Yong-sim recovered enough to walk, she was returned to service. Malnutrition was systematic and documented. Food rations for comfort stations were recorded in supply logs as lower than those provided to Korean auxiliary laborers, themselves already inadequate by military nutritional standards. Women received rice mixed with cheaper grains, minimal vegetables, almost no protein. The insufficient nutrition weakened their body's capacity to fight infections and recover from physical trauma. It also served a control function. Weakened women lacked the physical capability for resistance or escape attempts. Park Yong-sim's weight dropped significantly. Her hair began falling out in clumps. Her menstrual cycles became irregular, then ceased entirely. These symptoms were common among station women. Military medical records noted malnutrition-related symptoms, but recommended no meaningful changes to rations. The women's deteriorating health was accepted as an inevitable operational cost. Psychological deterioration paralleled physical decline. Park Yong-sim noticed herself becoming numb to her own suffering. Pain that would have been unbearable in her first month felt routine by month 10. The numbness was not acceptance. It was her mind's protective shutdown when confronted with unending trauma. She stopped imagining escape. She stopped thinking about her family. She stopped planning for any future beyond the immediate hour. Yet small acts of connection persisted despite the institutional structure. Women found ways to communicate. Whispered exchanges during brief moments in washing facilities, notes hidden in laundry, glances across the compound that conveyed solidarity. These connections were fragile and dangerous. Women caught communicating were punished with isolation or reduced rations. But the human need for connection proved stronger than fear. Park Young-sim learned the names of 3 other women. She learned fragments of their stories during stolen moments. These relationships were barely more than acknowledgement of shared suffering, but they were evidence that she remained human in an apparatus engineered to reduce her to an object. Knowing that others existed, that others endured, that she was not alone, this knowledge was itself a form of resistance against erasure. Military operational documents describe station schedules with administrative precision. Operating hours typically ran from early afternoon until late evening, extending further when troop units prepared for deployment or returned from combat operations. The documents specified time allocations per soldier, 15 to 30 minutes per transaction. These time limits were enforced by guards who monitored room occupancy and moved soldiers through with calculated efficiency. For Park Young-sim, military efficiency translated into personal endurance of repetitive trauma. She learned to recognize footsteps in the corridor outside room 7. She learned to distinguish the sounds, the guards' boots announcing the next arrival, the varied footsteps of different soldiers. Young conscripts often moved nervously, uncertainly. Officers walked with expectation of deference. Veterans treated the entire process as routine transaction, requiring no ceremony. She developed survival calculations. She learned to read moods rapidly, to respond in ways that might minimize violence. She discovered that appearing compliant sometimes shortened encounters. She found that complete emotional absence made some soldiers uncomfortable enough to leave sooner. These were not choices in any meaningful sense. They were desperate adaptations made in the complete absence of actual agency. Military medical records from multiple comfort stations document systematic physical damage. Women experienced vaginal tearing, cervical trauma, internal infections, and pelvic injuries. The medical reports employed clinical language, trauma consistent with repeated forced penetration, infection secondary to inadequate recovery time, complications from mechanical injury. The language was detached, scientific, deliberately devoid of human acknowledgement. Park Young-sim's body accumulated damage that medical records would have catalogued as routine station conditions. Scar tissue formed internally. Chronic pain became her normal state. Her ability to walk without discomfort diminished progressively. But the military operation required her continued operational functionality. The military doctor's treatment focused not on healing, but on maintaining her capacity to continue service. She received antibiotics when infections caused fever high enough to impair her ability to comply, but preventive care was non-existent. Survivors who provided testimony decades later described dissociative states during their captivity, the sensation of watching their own bodies from outside, of feeling disconnected from physical sensation. This was not metaphorical description. It was documented psychological response to sustained trauma that exceeds human capacity to process normally. The mind protects itself by creating distance from unbearable present reality. Park Young-sim experienced these fragmentations regularly. During her assigned hours, she often could not form clear memories of specific encounters. Her consciousness would simply absent itself. She would find herself afterward with no coherent memory of the previous hour, only physical evidence on her body that something had occurred. This protective dissociation allowed her to survive psychologically, but it also meant losing pieces of herself to blank spaces where memory should have existed. In her 14th month at the station, something shifted during one encounter. A soldier entered room 7 and, unusually, began talking before approaching her. He appeared young, probably 19 or 20. He was intoxicated. He talked about his family in rural Japan, about how he missed his younger sister. He said Park Young-sim's face reminded him of her. For a brief moment, he seemed to see her as a person rather than as a station resource. His eyes focused on her face instead of evaluating her body. He asked her name. She gave the Japanese name she had been assigned. He asked her real name, the name she had before. She had not spoken it aloud in over a year. She said, Park Young-sim. Speaking her own name after so long felt like reclaiming a fragment of herself she had believed permanently lost. The soldier looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, perhaps recognition of shared humanity, perhaps guilt, perhaps horror at comprehending what he was participating in. He stood up. He left room 7 without touching her. He never returned to the station again, according to the guard roster she sometimes glimpsed. That single encounter, that brief moment where she was seen as a person rather than as military property, stayed with her. It did not undo the accumulated damage. It did not erase the trauma. But it proved to her that she had not completely disappeared. Park Young-sim, the person, still existed somewhere beneath the number assigned to room 7. That knowledge became something she returned to mentally when dissociation failed and awareness forced itself back. The anomaly did not repeat. The next soldier who entered did not ask her name. Neither did the one after that, nor any of the dozens who followed. The quota system continued unchanged. The schedule continued uninterrupted. Her body continued deteriorating on the trajectory established by systematic harm. But that single moment of being recognized as human became a psychological anchor, evidence that she was still there, still herself, still Park Young-sim, despite everything designed to erase her. In August 1945, Japan surrendered to Allied forces. The Comfort Station network, which had operated across occupied territories for over 13 years, ended not through policy reform, but through military defeat. Documents from the final weeks show frantic efforts at evidence destruction. Station records were burned in courtyard fires. Women were sometimes abandoned at remote locations when Japanese military personnel evacuated. In some documented cases, women were killed to eliminate witnesses who could testify to what had occurred. Park Young-sim's station was abandoned by its Japanese operators 4 days before Soviet forces reached the area. The guards and station manager simply left during the night. The women, weakened and disoriented, found themselves suddenly unguarded, but still trapped by circumstance. They had no money, no transportation, no clear knowledge of where they were geographically or how to return to their home regions. The Japanese government's initial response was complete denial. Official statements claimed no such institutional structure had existed. When documents surfaced proving otherwise, the government revised its position to claim the operation had been managed by private contractors, not by military administration. When overwhelming evidence emerged of direct military involvement, the government acknowledged some institutional role, but insisted that participation had been voluntary and that women had been compensated. Survivors faced a different kind of imprisonment after liberation. Korean society, deeply influenced by traditional Confucian values regarding women's purity, often rejected women who had been in comfort stations. Families sometimes refused to acknowledge them, fearing social stigma would affect other daughters' marriage prospects. Employment opportunities were limited because the stain of having been in a station followed them. Many survivors lived in poverty, silence, and isolation for decades. Pak Young-sim returned to Korea in early 1946 after months of difficult travel. Her family had been told she died during the war. When she appeared at their door, alive but profoundly altered, her father could not meet her eyes. Her younger sister asked what had happened during her years away. Pak Young-sim said only, "I was working in a factory in Manchuria." She never corrected that lie within her family. The truth remained locked inside her. Historians estimate between 50,000 and 200,000 women were caught in the comfort station network across its operational period. The wide numerical range reflects the systematic destruction of records and the difficulty of documenting an operation intentionally designed to leave minimal trace. Survivors who eventually came forward publicly represented a small fraction of the total. Most women never spoke openly, either because they died before they could or because social shame imposed by their own societies kept them permanently silent. Medical records that survived indicate high mortality rates within stations themselves. Women died from untreated infections, from complications following forced abortions, from malnutrition, from suicide. Some died when stations were struck during military bombardments. Others died after liberation from complications that had been deliberately left untreated during their captivity, their bodies too damaged to recover. Park Young-sim lived until 1998. She never married. She never had children. She worked in a factory, a real factory this time, for 30 years. She never spoke publicly about her experiences in the comfort station. She died with her true history known only to herself, carried in silence to her grave. This is not a story about one nation's unique evil. This is a story about what becomes possible when systems of power operate without effective accountability. The comfort station structure succeeded because it had official approval, bureaucratic organization, legal justification, and widespread societal complicity. It was documented in triplicate because it was considered legitimate military administration. That institutional legitimacy, that systematic, normalized nature, is precisely what made it so devastatingly effective. The most dangerous aspect of this machinery was not its cruelty, but its normalcy within its operational context. It functioned for over 13 years across multiple countries. Thousands of people participated in its administration at various levels. It had allocated budgets, established supply chains, standard operating procedures. It was integrated into military planning as routinely as ammunition procurement or medical supply distribution. The apparatus transformed human beings into logistical resources and called it administrative efficiency. The archives where these documents were discovered still exist. Researchers can read military reports that describe women as necessary supplies in the same logistical language used for equipment. They can examine medical records that document systematic harm with clinical detachment. They can study transport manifests that tracked women's movements like cargo shipments. The paper trail of institutional atrocity is preserved, available for anyone willing to look directly at what bureaucracy made possible. But preservation of evidence is not equivalent to accountability. The Japanese government has issued various statements over the decades, some acknowledging suffering occurred, others disputing specific details of coercion and institutional responsibility. Official apologies have been offered, then undermined by subsequent denials from government officials. History textbooks in Japan often minimize or entirely omit the comfort station program. The battle over how this history is remembered, taught, and acknowledged continues in present day. Systems of exploitation do not announce themselves as evil. They arrive with official documentation, legal justifications, bureaucratic procedures. They operate openly because they have convinced sufficient numbers of people that they are necessary, practical, or unavoidable. They target people who lack power to resist effectively, people whose voices can be silenced, whose disappearances can be explained away through official language, whose suffering can be minimized in administrative reports. The comfort station structure succeeded because it followed proper bureaucratic procedures. It documented everything meticulously. It operated with official governmental and military approval. That institutional legitimacy is precisely what made it possible to trap tens of thousands of women for over a decade. The most efficient form of large-scale cruelty is the kind that files paperwork and follows administrative protocols. Where are the systems today that operate with official approval while causing systematic harm to vulnerable populations? What documentation exists now that future generations will discover and ask, how did this continue for so long? Why did no one intervene? Women exist in present day whose names we do not know, whose suffering is filed away in bureaucratic language, whose experiences are denied by official narratives and institutional power. Park Young-sim spent 53 years after liberation living with memories she could not speak about in a society that did not want to hear them. She carried the documentation of institutional atrocity in her body and mind, while official paper documents were being systematically destroyed or hidden in government archives. She was the evidence that survived. And she died in silence, her testimony unspoken, her truth unheard except by herself. The most dangerous structures are the ones we have stopped questioning because they appear normal, legitimate, officially sanctioned. The most effective lies are the ones written into policy documents and administrative procedures. The greatest cruelty is the kind that maintains proper documentation while denying human reality. Her name was Park Young-sim. That matters, because the apparatus tried to erase it, tried to reduce her to a number in a station log, tried to make her disappear into bureaucratic language. Remembering her name is the minimum act of resistance against institutional erasure.